Special thank you to David Schwartz for a wonderful Haftorah. I'm glad you're all with me on this lockdown Shabbat. And it's been a long time. We've been talking about the pandemic for many, many months. We're creeping up to that date in March in which we began this form of shul and communication. As I've mentioned before, it's increasingly difficult and harder each week to feed through a camera to people who are beyond the four walls, and myself as well. It's everything's changed in shul, everything. And we don't know what the future holds. We hope, no matter what, we hope it's a safe and healthy one for everybody, and that indeed we do return soon. As you know, I'm on sabbatical, which normally would mean you wouldn't see me at all, but I made a commitment to be here on Shabbat under the circumstances and read Torah, and I'm happy to do that so that we can continue sharing some thoughts and ideas. This week's portion is the opening of the book of Exodus, and it's, as always, a jam-packed portion. There's always something surprising, unexpected, and every year that goes by, you learn more and more and more. And remember, in my conversations with you, I am not shoehorning the Torah into the pandemic. We are simply looking for some enlightenment and connection to both the modern and ancient ideas that have significance during this time. And I need not tell you that it's been a hugely significant week in the political arena. And I'm also going to tell you that this week's portion is entirely political. And we're going to explore that in a moment. The theme that we're going to be looking at today is civil disobedience versus violent disobedience. And for those of you like me who have studied intensely the civil rights movement in the United States, you know that civil rights and the right of people to protest peacefully was hugely significant in bringing about the change that we see today and still need to see. We also know that often civil disobedience or peaceful protest can be met with violence, and often is. And sometimes, often, peaceful protest can turn into violent protest. And the cycle continues. Violence begets violence begets violence. There's no trust that when someone says it's a peaceful protest, it's peaceful. Let's explore the book of Exodus and the story of Moses. We know that Moses was rescued by the daughter of Pharaoh from the river from certain death. What was a baby doing in the river? The baby was in the river because part of the eugenics program of the Egyptian government at the time was every male child that was born was to be tossed into the river. The river brought all the good to Egypt. When it flooded every year, the Nile created fertile land as far as the eye could see. And when the land was flooded, it produced great produce. Egypt was the breadbasket of the world at the time. And the Nile was the god. The Nile provided everything: bathing, drinking water, fertility, spiritual connection. And it was this ribbon of life that ran through all of Egypt. But it also became the choice of the government of the time for a eugenics program in which to eliminate Jewish males and therefore have Jewish women, or the Hebrew women, intermarry, and that would absorb them into their culture, and they would end the threat that they had within them, a fifth column called the Hebrews. which they were aware of from the time of Joseph and Jacob, that this outsider group had come in and, as I spoken before, had taken over and had too much power and had too much privilege. But they didn't have the power or the will to annihilate them because they were a workforce. They were tax-paying citizens. They were foreigners. But they figured they'd get rid of the males. That would solve the problem. They'd strengthen their own world. They'd absorb the foreign women, and that would be it. And that is where we arrive at the beginning of the portion. As I mentioned, the beginning of the portion to the next step in the story of the midwives is almost 200 years, at least. And we find ourselves in a situation where these two midwives named Shifra and Puah, who are they? We don't really know. The Midrash tries to link them to Miriam and Yocheved, the mother and sister of Moses, but it's not clear. We don't even know who they were. We do know they were Hebrews, and we know that they created a giant secret program of birthing of babies. And they did everything in their power to encourage women to go and have their babies in the fields, out of sight, not in hospitals or not in birthing homes, so that their babies could not be counted. And they rescued thousands and thousands and thousands of male Jewish babies from certain death. And that's the opening of today's story. And Pharaoh calls them to task and says, what is going on here? I've instructed that they need to be eliminated. Throw them into the river. And their answer is, hey, listen, these Jewish women, they just give birth whenever they give birth. We have no control over it. By the time we get there, they're gone. We can't help it. And then Pharaoh doubles down, and you'll see if you read the portion, he then announces the law. The law is every male has to be thrown into the river, and every female child can live. Almost as if the government was creating a pro forma law. That is going to be the law. I'm sorry, you're not changing the law. But they must have looked aside. They must have. Because at some point, Hebrew males started to be born, and they were obviously joining the workforce, and obviously they were present. So once the risk of them in childhood was gone, they were allowed to live. So it means that the law became on the books. It was a fatwa. Whenever a baby is born, it has to be thrown in the river. But if it wasn't thrown in the river, it could live. So all they had to do was get through the birth moment, and if it wasn't discarded right then and there, it was safe. And that's what these two female heroes of the Torah did. They just managed to change the moment of birth so there wasn't permission to destroy the child. They could not go and take the child away from its mother once it had left the birthstone, so to speak. That was civil disobedience at the highest order. And the risk they took was extraordinary. But they did it because they saved lives. So that is the opening story of civil disobedience. Midwives saving babies from certain death very effectively. And then we come across a second story of civil disobedience. But it's different. It's Moses growing up in a privileged home, going out to Egyptian society and discovering that he was a Hebrew. He may have known he was a Hebrew in advance, it's not clear, but he gets out there and people know who he is. And they say, you're a Hebrew just like us. And he sees an Egyptian overlord mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave. He now has this new and emerging awareness of his identity. He suddenly empathizes not with the Egyptian, but with the Hebrew. He feels the sting and lash of the whip on his own back. He could imagine himself now being a Hebrew, being oppressed. and he kills the Egyptian overlord and buries him in the sand. Well, an act of violent disobedience, clearly. Moses used his Egyptian privilege to act in a way that no Hebrew would have acted. But he was a Hebrew. And the Hebrews who saw him and witnessed were uncomfortable with the idea that they would be seen as having created violent disobedience, so they ratted him out. And Moses, despite being a so-called prince of Egypt, has to run for his life. He's tried, he's convicted, he flees. He ends up in Midian. That's the whole story of meeting Zipporah. He sees the burning bush. He gets information many years later, many years later. We're talking almost a lifetime, 70 years later. Moses has an encounter with God who asks him to go back to Egypt. So we open our portion with a story of civil disobedience, passive, active resistance, but nonviolent. And then we have the story of Moses, a violent resistance to what he sees as injustice, and it has a huge cost. Moses leaves Egypt for over 70 years. The politics of Egypt are also very unclear. What is happening? What were the Jewish people doing? The popular perception is that they were brutalized slaves, but it's not entirely clear that that lasted the entire time. It's possible that they started off being heavily enslaved, but over time they became just a workforce that were mistreated as they were foreigners. It's not clear that by the time the Exodus arrives, they were still a workforce. They might have been let go of their duties. But the story of Moses' return to Egypt clearly roils the comfortable fabric of whatever relationship had happened. Moses is told by God, it's okay for you to go back to Egypt. The people who sought your death for the murder of that Egyptian have died. You're off the hook. You can go back safely. Eventually, he heads back. And as I mentioned to you, there was that strange story of Moses and his wife and the angel and swallowing his child and the circumcision. And it's a whole complicated story. You should research it because it's way too complicated for today. And it's such an anomaly, an unusual text, that it really needs to be explored. So Moses returns after the threat to his life is revoked, and now he finds himself in a whole new political dimension. It is clear from the text that the Hebrews have made peace with their role in Egypt. They were probably a downtrodden, abused class, low class, and their job, if you were a Hebrew, was to make bricks. That's what you did. You made bricks. It doesn't say they built the pyramids. It says they made bricks to build the great storehouses of Ramses. Well, I'm not an expert in archaeology, but it doesn't tell us anywhere that the Hebrews were involved in the construction of these massive projects, but they may have built bricks that were used for these massive projects. It's possible. Their job was to take the straw that was delivered to them by a workforce and use the straw and the mud in great pits and turn them into bricks. And when Moses returns and he begins to challenge Pharaoh, you start to see this extraordinary dynamic emerge, one in which Moses has come back to a society that has made peace with its job and its duty and responsibility. They are a working class people who have clearly figured out how to get by. The Midrash tells us they didn't change their names, they didn't change their clothing. They always knew their identity was Hebrew. But they did not always know their relationship to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Remember, it's a long time ago. And there were promises made to them through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that they'll have a land of their own. But that was lore, that was legend. Right now they were oppressed, they were busy, they were creaking under the weight of their responsibilities, and they hoped for some kind of salvation. But who knew? What does salvation mean? Maybe someday this will get better. Moses appears to Pharaoh and says, with the elders of the Hebrews and Aaron, his brother, and they go to Pharaoh and they say, listen, our people are unique. They're not just Egyptian slaves. We want to go pray to our God. Let us go. We'll come back. We just want to go. In other words, we just want to remind them of their internal identity. Well, you could see that that would be the beginning of an empowerment movement. Moses was about to empower them with a sense of their own identity, unique identity, which is a huge challenge to the ruling class. That there should be a united front of self-identification as something other than a working class person, some greater vision, like we want a land, we have a vision, we have a promise. It riles people up, and they don't work as hard because they have daydreams. Sure enough, the moment that Moses starts challenging Pharaoh, Pharaoh has a new rule. From now on, there will be no straw given to the Hebrew slaves. They have to collect their own straw. You used to have straw delivered to you in the morning. You'd chop it up. You'd use mud. You'd add lime. You do everything you do. You turn it into bricks in the sun. Great, and you went home at night. No, you have to collect your own straw. Oh, and by the way, the quota of bricks that you had to deliver, you still have to deliver. I don't care that you have to work 3 times as hard. Pharaoh clearly was doubling down on his threat to Moses, saying, not only will you not leave with your people or create an identity for them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make them realize that you are not a good thing for them. You are hurting them. Now, what could have happened? What could have happened is the people of Israel could have rebelled. They could have said, we're on strike. You don't give us straw, we're not making bricks. They might have tried that. Maybe they were enthused with the idea of Moses being some kind of savior. Maybe they heard the rumor that Moses, who was former prince of Egypt, had come back and he was challenging Pharaoh. And he wanted freedom for his people. He wanted fairness. The grapes of wrath were full. And he wanted integrity. And he wanted equality. And he wanted their promise fulfilled. And Pharaoh challenged him. And there was one ingredient that turned the tide. They couldn't go on strike because the Egyptians had set up a system of Jewish overlords, of kapos, so to speak. And they mercilessly enforced the rules of Egypt, not the Egyptians, the Hebrews, on their own people. Nothing was more disheartening. Nothing deflated their ambition more than seeing their own brethren say to them, I don't care what Moses, this outsider Hebrew, comes here and tells you. You get to work. We're doing it for your own good. We're beating you for your own good. Because if you don't do it, it's going to get worse. The Egyptians will kill us. They'll destroy us. Do your job, get the straw, make the bricks, stop complaining. Moses is ruining everything for everybody. It turned on the Jewish overlords. That is why the portion ends with the challenge from the people who say, Moses, ever since you got here, you made this place stink. Everything's gotten worse since you arrived, not better. And Moses' initial attempt at swaying the people and swaying Pharaoh utterly fails. And he goes back to God, and he says to God, listen to this incredible quote. Vayomar, and Moses says, Adonai, my master, my Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why have you sent me here? And since I came to Pharaoh as you instructed me, and you made me all sorts of promises that things would go well, lidaber bishmecha, to speak in your name. I spoke in your name to Pharaoh, not in my name. You know I didn't want to be here, says Moses. I came for you. And I came to speak to Pharaoh on your behalf. Hareya la'am, he has only done worse to the people. And v'hatzel lo hitzalta et hamecha, and you have not rescued your people. You have not rescued your people. You promised, I tried, you have not delivered. Civil disobedience, passive disobedience, violent disobedience, it all fails. And the portion ends this week with the beginning of a chapter. It's only one verse in a chapter. Normally, the portions would be divided before or after a chapter. Rarely do you find one verse and then next week's portion. And here's the verse. And God says to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh, because with a mighty hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand I will make him chase them from his land. So that's where we get into the familiar story of the back and forth between Pharaoh, Moses, God, the plagues, and the Exodus. But this week's portion is entirely a story of an attempted civil disobedience program. It starts with the mialdot, the midwives. It continues with Moses in violent fashion. It continues with the Hebrews and their overlords. And ultimately, Moses makes the claim to the people, and he says to them, I have come here, to quote the famous line, to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Even amongst the Hebrews, there are comfortable people who have figured out how to live in this civilization. You're comfortable. It's hard. It hurts. You krechts. It's difficult. You go home at night, you're exhausted. But you found comfort in a sort of normal structure. But it's a terrible place to be. You have a promise of a land and a vision waiting for you, and you're going to make bricks your entire life. But they were comfortable. They were comfortable enough under the circumstance that when it got worse or changed, they couldn't resist. And Moses said, I am here to afflict the comfortable. But he's also there to comfort the afflicted, because there were many who needed salvation. Now, I often think about Moses as sort of the celebrity prince returning to Egypt. And I want to just share a brief thought about the problem that Moses has when he returns is he's a celebrity. He's known. He's the guy that killed the Egyptian. He's the former prince who was raised in Pharaoh's home. They found him in the water. He comes back. He does all these miracles. He's got snakes in his hand. He's got leprosy in his pocket. He can do anything. Moses is a hero. But was he a leader? Moses himself says, I'm not a leader. Moses says, I have trouble speaking. Moses is insecure about his role. Moses rightfully is insecure. Who am I? He says. Who am I? God says, I'll bolster you. I'll be right behind you. And that's why Moses challenges and says, you're not right behind me. You set me up. Moses is essentially saying, I'm a celebrity, not a leader. Moses has to transition from a celebrity to a leader. And as you go through the book of Exodus, and then Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, watch the change in Moses, how he goes from being a star to being a leader. of great substance. And whether you agree with him or not, he really works hard to become the leader that God said he could be. Probably much more slowly than was anticipated, and even furthermore, with a lot of pushback on God. This is one of the interesting things. I'm not a big fan of talking about God vis-a-vis other people, what God wants, what God says. But in the biblical narrative, the story of God and Moses is like best friends. And they fight and they argue, and there's some unresolved arguments in the Bible between God and Moses primarily. And they are two extraordinarily powerful friends and also adversaries. What is best for the people? What is right? Moses takes advice from many people. And God and Moses are constantly at loggerheads. It's really an extraordinary story. And I'd like you to hear it long term, not just this week, because every week now, Moses will be present. So when you think about celebrities and leaders, one of my favorites passed away this week, Tommy Lasorda, who was the manager of the Dodgers. He was a Dodger. I mean, everything about him was Dodgers. And when I first encountered him through baseball, you thought he was a bit of a clown. He and his antics, go online, just look at Tommy Lasorda's biggest fights with umpires. My goodness, this guy could go. He changed baseball forever. Him and Earl Weaver, they were the masters. Of course, can't forget Billy Martin and all those greats who knew how to rile up a team and how to fight and how to pick on opposition. The difference between Tommy Lasorda and others was he wasn't just a celebrity. He wasn't a buffoon. He wasn't a clown. He was a true leader. So when you read about Tommy Lasorda's passing, also read about what else he did in his life beyond the antics and the strategy that he was known for. This is what I like. I like people who are celebrity, but also have great leadership. Because celebrity is hollow without leadership. Now, in talking about civil disobedience and the breakdown of law and how to protest, I want to ask you all a question. Are you part of the 48% who have protested over the last month the COVID conditions that we find ourselves in? And when I say 48%, I'm referring to the fact that over the Hanukkah, Christmas, New Year holiday period, respected polls and research surveys have found that 48% of Canadians visited other people who were not in their bubble during the holidays. 48%. My friends, that is a lot of civil disobedience. And that may account for the numbers we have today. I'm not calling anybody out. If we went and did a visit, it was a drive-by. It was far. So that could be part of the 48%. It was totally kosher. It's totally right. But there are many people who said, I cannot abide a holiday without friends and family. And many, many, many people took chances with others. And I'm not here to suggest that it was bad or good. I have my doubts that it was good. But we realize there's a lot of reality that has to be overlaid with pandemic behaviors, such as going back to school, what stays open, what doesn't. There are people that we know have traveled to Florida. Turns out the snowbirds who went to Florida are entitled to get a shot if you're over 65. We saw our good friend Perry Cohen and Rose. We saw an article in the CBC. Perry Cohen goes to Florida. God bless him. He gets the COVID shot because he's over 65 and he's entitled to get it. There are a lot of people who thought it would turn out one way. It turns out another way. But 48% of people visited. And that is a form of civil disobedience. It's a way in which we disobey to some degree, not necessarily as a protest against the system, but a protest against the circumstance. And that's what was taken away from the Hebrews. They couldn't even protest the circumstance. But the midwives, they protested, and they saved lives. And friends, I'm going to tell you a joke. I don't tell very many jokes during COVID, but it's not a joke. Listen to this. A black man and a Jew walk into a bar in Georgia. The bartender looks at them and says, "What will it be today, senators?" Can you imagine? If I told you this joke a year ago, 2 years ago, a black man and a Jew are senators in the state of Georgia. Can you imagine? Kannst du dich vorstellen that is where we've arrived at? And I wanted to say, without violence. I wanted to say civil disobedience. I wanted to say civil rights marches. I wanted to invoke Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. I wanted to talk about that. But that narrative's been hijacked. Now it's a narrative that will forever be known as violent. And I'm telling you, if we were in Shul live today, we would not be here politically protesting. We'd be here protesting the fact that violence has become a regular daily occurrence in the effort to create democracy. We're not Americans. Well, I'm half American. We're not Americans. We have a different system. But violence has visited our hall of parliament too. Not quite the same way. And we know that what's happening in the United States is unprecedented. And there are some who are overblowing it, and there are some who are under-acknowledging it. But to the ordinary person, like myself, who doesn't have a stake in party politics, I'm not partisan. I only believe in doing what's right for the people. And I am part of the people. And I can tell you there is nothing about what happened in the Senate that makes me believe that this was a healthy part of democracy. And it's infuriating. And it's a terrible, tragic loss of life. 5 people have now died. Oh, and you'll say, it was rabid anti-Semites. Ugh, they're all white supremacists. No. Sorry, friends. There were many ugly people there, of many different stripes, of many different varieties. Yes, the focal point can be on the proudly anti-Semitic and violently, grossly vulgar slogans about 6 million is not enough, Camp Auschwitz, we had all that. But we also had the son of a rabbi wearing fur in the rotunda. Orthodox Jews, by large majority, will self-identify as Trump supporters. And I don't think most of them, and from what I've read, approve of the violence. But they were there. A lot of them were there. I have a friend who was there. They also claim, of course, that it was overblown. But I don't know. I wasn't there. I do know ultimately there was violence. And I do ultimately know that it's a stain on democracy. And again, people like when we comment about our own feelings. You want to know how I feel about the American government? I don't talk about that. But what I do want to talk about is the difference between civil disobedience and violent disobedience. Moses struggled tremendously to gain traction when he came back to Pharaoh because he had been violently disobedient, and he had to prove that he could be civilly disobedient. In the end, Moses and God revert back to violent disobedience through the plagues. I would not have believed that a Jew and a black man would be senators in Georgia. But I'm glad they are. It's a bright spark. It's a bright moment in some very dark times. I don't know what the future holds in the United States of America. I don't know what the future holds here. I don't know what the future holds for us in Canada because of COVID, financially. There's a lot of unknowns. But I do know this. As King Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes, for everything there is a season and a time for everything under heaven. And friends, there's a time to resist and a time to refrain from resisting. My hope is, let's not resist the lockdown. Let's do our part to stay home and stay safe, and let's never be afraid to comfort the afflicted first, and then afflict the comfortable. Shabbat Shalom.